High-speed pursuits are among the riskiest police activities. Some pursuits catch bad guys, but in others, many thousands have been killed or severely injured, including innocent civilians. Are chases worth the deaths and injuries to citizens and officers? A closer look at high-speed police chases on this episode of Criminal Injustice.
Criminal Injustice is produced in partnership with 90.5 WESA, Pittsburgh's NPR news station, streaming and podcasting at WESA.fm.
Welcome to Criminal Injustice. I'm David Harris, your guide, nerd, geek, and explainer of all things in our sprawling and messy criminal justice system. I thankfully still have that job as a professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Now, that sound that you're hearing is probably familiar to most of us who spend any time watching television or YouTube videos. A high-speed chase captured by a police dash cam recording, ending in a crash. Chases are surprisingly common occurrences, yet they have not received anything like the scrutiny of, say, police shootings. Now, how bad is this problem, and what can be done? It's important to begin with a very clear statement. Police chases start when a civilian in a vehicle does not yield to police instructions or authority and either doesn't stop as ordered or drives away. Any person in that situation can choose to obey the police, but some don't. And it is those bad decisions that start these actions that we call high-speed chases or police pursuits. The question for police and for us here today is when the suspect refuses to stop or drives away, how should the police react? Should they chase the suspect down, perhaps in a densely populated area, at high speed if necessary to apprehend the fleeing person? Always or just some of the time? And if not always, what are the limits for these situations? Let's talk stats a little bit. Roughly 35 to 40% of police chases end in a crash. By one count, from a 2007 study, roughly 323 persons on average a year are killed in or as a result of high-speed pursuits. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has said that the average may be 360 people a year. Our guest today says that the actual number may be much higher than that. Now, in those crashes, about 1% of those killed are police officers. 72% are people who are in the fleeing vehicle, and that may be either the person driving it or a passenger in that vehicle. But 27% are innocent bystanders, people who are not involved at all, who are killed while they're walking nearby or crossing the street or while driving another uninvolved vehicle. Now, according to one reckoning published in 2015, more than 5,000 bystanders and passengers were killed during high-speed police pursuits between 1979 and 2013, and tens of thousands of more were injured. The damage done in deaths and injuries and to families and communities is just devastating. Here's just one example of many hundreds one can easily find online. This audio comes from NBC TV station KARK in Little Rock, Arkansas. Take a listen.
The family's understandably overwhelmed with grief over this, but they have not overlooked how it all happened. One man and relative out there called it a drive-by without a gun. They're now struggling with the death of the mother and hoping her daughter can recover.
And all I could do is drop on my knees, pray to God that it's just a dream.
Marcia Givens got the call late Tuesday night that her niece was killed by someone running from police along Chico Road in South Little Rock earlier that evening.
It seems like it's not real.
As the family visits the memorial at the crash site for 39-year-old Tindia Horton, the reality sets in.
Her smile.
Her voice.
Yeah. Personality, how she loved her family, her kids, her kids came first. You don't do this in a neighborhood. It could have been more like all us said it out here now. What if one come flying through here now?
It's a huge cost in innocent lives. The question is, Is it worth it? So what we have to ask is, first and foremost, what offenses do police chase people for? How serious are the offenses that begin the police contact with the suspect? And are these chases then worth what they cost in death and injury to innocent people? Now, if you think that these high-risk activities are all about apprehending dangerous criminals, well, you're in for a surprise. Here are some basic numbers about who police are chasing in these pursuits. According to a 2007 study, 91%, that's 9 out of 10, of police pursuits do not involve a violent crime. Now, if 9 out of 10 pursuits have nothing to do with violent felonies and with a significant risk of injuries and deaths as a cost, should officers be engaging in as many vehicle pursuits as they are? Is it worth it? And what are the alternatives? Our guest today probably knows more about this than anyone. As one of the country's preeminent criminologists, he's been at the forefront of research on a whole variety of high-risk police activities for more than 30 years, and over that period of time, he's become the go-to guy for insight on the topic of police pursuits of suspects. Dr. Geoffrey P. Alpert is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of South Carolina. He has taught at the FBI National Academy, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and the Senior Management Institute for Police, and he's currently a federal monitor for the New Orleans Police Department and on the compliance team for the Portland, Oregon Police Bureau. He's given testimony to Congress, several state legislatures, and the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and he is a member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police Research Advisory Committee. Now, for more than 3 decades, his research interests have included emergency and pursuit driving, as well as police use of force, accountability systems, police researcher partnerships, you name it. His 1997 National Institute of Justice research brief on high-speed pursuits, for which we'll put up a link on our website, is one of the most widely quoted pieces of work on the subject ever written, still that way 20 years later. His books include Police Pursuit Driving, Policy and Research, a 2014 publication with co-author Cynthia Lum. Dr. Geoff Alpert, welcome to Criminal Injustice.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Well, Dr. Alpert, let's start with basic information that citizens would need to evaluate these high-speed chases. According to your research over the years, what are chases for? What is the suspected crime which gets the ball rolling?
Well, unfortunately, as you mentioned, for the most part, it's a minor traffic offense. We've looked over the years at the hundreds, if not thousands, of police departments' policies and records, and for the most part, in the 80s and even into the 90s, we see that the officers are allowed to chase for anything, and therefore the most frequent offense is traffic.
The most frequent offense is traffic. That means what you're saying is these things start with a traffic offense, an officer trying to pull somebody over for anything that might go on the road.
Anything including a tail light out, a license plate light out, to speeding, to illegal turns, to something both moving and non-moving violations, some more serious than others, but still nothing that is earth-shaking.
So it could be almost anything you can imagine in terms of a traffic offense. Sometimes also, I seem to recall a stolen vehicle.
Stolen vehicles is a very high frequency of these events. And I will say, Dave, it's very important to understand that most policies ask the officer, among a variety of things, to balance the need to immediately apprehend the suspect. So that means, what did the suspect do? What do I know as a police officer that the suspect did? To balance that against the risk to the public. And that's a very interesting equation, because it looks at almost the same issues on use of force as state interest in capturing this person, with the risk to the person and to the public and to the officer by a continued pursuit.
So you're asking officers to do this balancing of risks kind of in the moment with regard to whether or not you chase somebody down who either doesn't stop or has pulled over and then decides to try to run away.
Correct, but I think we've got to understand that just because an officer pulls behind the fleeing suspect with his lights and sirens on, that's still a request. Unless an officer is to use a very high level of force, perhaps deadly force, to get the person to stop, the officer has no real way. There are tactics such as tire deflation devices, and there's what's called a pit maneuver, in which the officer actually pushes the car physically. But those are very high levels of force. They're very dangerous. And again, we're asking why? Well, what's the need to apprehend this person? Obviously, if it's a very serious crime, a rape, a robbery, a murder, then officers are given much more freedom to do that. If it's a minor offense, even a traffic offense, high speeds, then we really have to question, is this a good tactic?
Right, and 9 out of 10 times you're saying it starts with something pretty minor, and that raises the question all the more.
Well, that's right, and fortunately over the years things have changed, where police chiefs now are taking that decision out of the officer's hand and making it themselves in policy. We're seeing a lot of departments who, the chief now limits the pursuit to a violent crime, which is exactly where it should be.
Right. So I know you've been doing this work for a long time, and you've sat in the room with police officials. I mean, you're a veteran of this. I know that when a police chief makes a rule like that says only violent crimes, officers, line officers, people like that, they really chafe at that. They don't like the idea that the bad guys will get away. Put us into the mindset of that line officer, that officer out there. What is it that sticks in their craw so badly about a rule like you can only chase for violent crimes?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. Officers join the police because they want to catch bad guys. They want to make the road safer, and they're taught initially that to make the road safer, you have to pull someone off the road. But actually, to make the road safer, sometimes you just have to turn around and go home and let this person go for the time being, because you have no way to get them to stop. It's a crapshoot, if you will, that the person's going to stop, and actually, more likely than not, the person won't stop once the pursuit starts until the police officer terminates his or her active attempt, or the person crashes, and that's a heck of a dichotomy there. So the officer has to be the adult, has to be the trained person, and has to understand when these things go too far.
When do they go too far, in your opinion? Because I've read your work for a long time, and it does seem to me that you have come to the point over this period of time where you're prepared to say it's just not a good idea to do this. How do you make a rule that tells officers when it's not a good idea?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we started the premise, and I believe it was in 1997 when I wrote that National Institute of Justice brief, that we used the term violent felony, because this is what the progressive police chiefs and progressive police officers were telling me. We saw some policies that had that language, and they seemed to be very successful. We did research in a variety of cities. I think the most comprehensive was in Orlando, Florida, when they changed their policy. We followed the criminal activities. We noticed that they saved lives by not chasing, but it had absolutely no impact in the increase in crime or offending. We saw, in fact, that people didn't flee from police more frequently when the police wouldn't chase them. And that's a myth that many people believe is true, that if you don't chase, everyone's going to run.
That is really important point. I want to give you a chance to emphasize that. Talk about what you did to figure out that if that was a myth.
Well, we assumed that it wasn't. We assumed that if police quit chasing, then people are going to run more frequently, and we simply had officers write down in a report or radio what they were doing, and we analyzed the reports, we analyzed the radio dispatches, and we found that over time the fact that police did not chase did not increase people fleeing. And that's a very important finding because it really answers a myth that officers will tell you if we don't chase, everyone's going to flee. And David, let me add the second myth that we were able to debunk. I mean, I sound like Mythbusters now, but we were able to debunk the myth that there's a dead body in every trunk. And that's meaning in training, some police departments tell their officers that you have to chase because you never know what this person's done.
That's a great point. It's a very important point. You know, I was looking for material to fill out our conversation, and I saw a lot of this very thing. One police officer, a guy who had been the head of the Milwaukee Police Association, in reaction to his chief making a rule that said you can only chase for violent felonies, he said that people are being chased, quote, because they may be wanted for sexual assaults, shootings, homicides. These pursuits are successfully concluded all the time to bring in those violent felons. And that just doesn't turn out to be true, does it?
Well, once in a while, I think in California, the California Highway Patrol did actually conclude a chase where there was a dead body in the trunk, but I believe that was 1 in 10,000. So, no, it doesn't happen very often. Most of the people who flee are young males making very bad decisions with enormous consequences. And I think it's important to add as well, you had mentioned some of the facts and figures. Sometimes, for the most part, passengers in these cars that flee are innocent bystanders. They're not involved in the chase. Many times they're telling the driver to stop, slow down, and they end up getting injured and killed as well. So it kind of ups the ante when there's more than one person in the car for the police to think very critically about is this worth continuing.
Now, as you have gone through the years working with police departments, Dr. Alpert, and the key idea becomes limiting chases to violent felonies. Where are things at now? How many police departments have a policy like that? What other important ingredients does a good policy have?
Well, unfortunately, we don't know how many policies are limited to violent crimes. There are 18,000 departments and 18,000 policies. We do see from time to time departments changing their policies to make them more restrictive, and I think the number keeps growing, but we don't have a very good idea. But I will tell you the major cities in America, the larger departments, and certainly the progressive departments are all limiting their chases to violent crime.
That brings us to another very interesting point. I mean, when our conversation airs, we will be the 47th episode of Criminal Injustice, and I am losing count of the number of times I have had a guest from law enforcement, from a think tank, from the university say, we don't know because we don't have the data. And I remember from your 1997 brief on this, one of the things that you were recommending was collect data on chases. Has that situation improved any?
Very slightly. There are now, I believe, 5 states that collect statewide data. I think most departments will keep the data individually, but then to gather that and combine it, there's no repository. We suggested, and I offered the University of South Carolina years ago to be a repository for these data. No one took me up on it. So we really don't have very good information, even on deaths. Now, you were talking about the NHTSA data, which is woefully underreported.
The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration data, and you're saying that even that isn't that great.
Correct. It's a voluntary program, and if someone dies a week later or dies after the police report is taken, it's not going to be updated. A lot of departments don't report it anyway, so they say approximately one a day. One person a day is going to die as a consequence of a chase. I think it's probably twice that high.
Twice that high. Grim stuff, but let's take a pause here because I think there's more good stuff ahead. This is Criminal Injustice. David Harris with you with our guest, Dr. Geoffrey Alpert from the University of South Carolina. We'll be right back.
Donald Trump wants to roll back America's environmental protections. Can he do this? Listen to a new podcast to find out.
Turns out he doesn't have the power as president to cancel international agreements.
Trump on Earth from the Allegheny Front and Point Park University on iTunes or trumponearth.org.
Hi, we're back. David Harris with Criminal Injustice, and our guest is Dr. Geoffrey Alpert of the University of South Carolina, and he is the guy nationwide on the subject of police chases and pursuits. Dr. Alpert, when we broke, we were talking about the fact that we didn't know how many policies were out there, what kind of changes there had been in policies, and we were actually still even in the dark on the subject of the data about chases and crashes themselves. One of the things that I remember you said back in your 1997 research brief was that some police departments train their officers for driving and for chases, and some do not. A smaller number train for pursuit. And then you use the following very memorable phrase, quote, "Training devoted to when or why to pursue appears to have been minimal or non-existent," close quote. Are we still there? Have things improved any with training?
Well, things have improved slightly. A lot of departments now, as I mentioned earlier, are limiting pursuits to violent crime. So the first thing an officer has to think, why am I pulling this person over? What violent crime did this person commit? And if he or she can't answer that, then you terminate the chase. It makes it a lot easier. But still, we're training more on how to drive, the apex of the corners, the braking abilities, and I think it's very important, obviously, but we need to spend more time on the why, the reason. Officers need to understand the evidence behind pursuits. It's going to help them realize that sometimes these chases are not worth it. It's going to help the officers understand how to balance that need to apprehend and the risk created by the chase. One of the things I often tell officers when I'm doing training is to ask how they would feel if their 16-year-old daughter, and I often use 16-year-old daughter for a reason, were injured or killed in a pursuit that one of his or her colleagues was chasing someone for a stolen car. Do you think that's appropriate? And of course, the argument is, oh, that's not fair. You're just getting personal. And I turn to them and say, you're exactly right. Every one of these victims is personal, is a mother, a father, a son, a daughter, and I think officers need to understand, even though they don't like it, but they need to understand the consequence of their actions.
That is so important, the consequences of their actions. I read some research that indicated that there is something going on with the natural tendency to want to engage in the chase, to not want to break it off. What's happening in an officer's head or almost in an officer's body that makes them want to keep going and pursue?
Well, just as we talked about before, the officers join the police force to catch bad guys, and they get caught up in it. Driving fast, driving dangerously, sirens screaming, lights blaring. I mean, it's an exciting, adrenaline-driven event, and it's very hard to come down from that. One of the consequences we see in pursuits is after the person, usually it's a slight crash where the officer gets out and all of a sudden you see him just wailing on the driver, and it's with no need. The person's injured, has his hands up, but the officer can't control him or herself, usually himself, and you see a lot of excessive force used after a pursuit because of the adrenaline and because of the changes a body goes through when the excitement and the challenge is there.
So there are actual physical changes with all that adrenaline happening that make it more difficult to back down and that even cause some terrible things happening when the chase is over.
Absolutely. Your body goes through the and I can't think of the specific terms other than we'll use adrenaline dump because that's exactly what happens, and it's a very exciting, very high risk event, and your body does go through changes that you need to relax afterwards. And one of the policies we're seeing become more popular now is that a second officer will make the arrest of the suspect, so the primary officer, whose heart's just going a mile a second, doesn't have to touch or get involved with the person, and it's a much safer strategy.
So you've got that part of it involving a second officer to protect a suspect who eventually crashes or surrenders. Is there a parallel thing that you could put in a policy about having somebody else's judgment involved? What about policies that require the permission of a supervisor to either engage in a chase or to give another officer a role or oversight, something like that? Is that done sometimes?
Most policies have a provision for what we call a detached supervisor to kind of keep an eye and an ear on what's going on. So if the officer doesn't follow through properly, the supervisor can terminate and can order the officer to do something else. And we see that happening more and more often. But even a detached supervisor obviously wants to catch the bad guy, but, instead of being a cop with stripes, this is a manager who has to understand the policy and understand the risks.
Absolutely. So we get somewhat of a different blend of judgments there. When you have a room full of police officers and you're teaching them about this and you're giving them this information, do you get a good hearing from them, or are they skeptical, or are they giving you don't understand what it's like out there? Because I've heard that sort of thing myself.
Well, I think in the last few years, the last decade, we've seen a lot more reasoned officers, because when they go to the academy, they don't get the chase into the wheels fall off mentality that older officers get. So we're starting to get young officers now who get a lot better training, who get a lot more information, and don't object so much to the policies that prohibit pursuits, but for very serious crimes. And even with that training, we're still seeing officers, I could say, make mistakes, make judgment errors because they get caught up, and the supervisors don't get there quick enough, or don't want to be that guy or that woman who terminates the chase.
So why do you think you're getting this different kind of officer now? What's the difference? Is it just sort of the old guard versus the new? What's happening?
Well, there's a lot going on now. Who's becoming a police officer? And we're seeing an enormous number of recruits, for example, who've never played sports or never had that kind of excitement that you get from a chase, and they don't thrive on it, where I think 15, 20 years ago, most of the people who joined the force just thrived on the excitement.
It was a different kind of person, in other words, that was coming into the police academy then versus now?
Right, and I think we see that in use of force situations. I think we see that certainly in driving, and it's not just emergency driving. We see that in routine driving as well. You would be shocked to learn how many police officers back into things just in a routine day. They're not paying attention, or they're distracted. Something else has come up, and they literally back their cars into telephone poles or other objects that cause all sorts of problems.
Is this because of some targeted recruiting? We're looking for another kind of person, or is it just the kind of people who are showing up applying?
I think it's more the latter of just who's applying for the job, who wants to be a police officer.
One of the things that I noticed in some of the writing on this is that some departments are saying to officers, there comes a time when you break off a chase, and you can't just stop doing it. You have to turn off your equipment, pull over to the side, and show the person being chased that you are no longer engaged in the chase. What's the point of that, and what does it do?
Well, that's exactly right. We're seeing policies now that vary from, you need to turn around, you need to go home, you need to pull over and radio in your mileage, your location. You want to give the message to the fleeing suspect, hey, you win. We're not chasing you. We've stopped. And what that does, in very short order, the fleeing suspect will slow down or stop or blend into traffic because he or she thinks, I've won. I win. The cops lost. And the bottom line is the person slows down, becomes safer, so everyone wins. And
when you say everyone wins, you mean not just the chances maybe of apprehending the person later, but first and foremost the safety of the public who might be exposed to the danger of a chase if it continued.
Exactly. And the suspect might win temporarily if you put enough resources into it. The officer's police department might capture him later, but the bottom line is the roads become safe once again.
Well, Dr. Geoffrey Alpert, we really appreciate hearing about